Hello again, it's Dr. Fridge here to talk about Chapter 9, Forms. Um, so here's the thing with forms. We've talked so much about tags. We talked about your basic tags, then we talked about things like lists and images and other content that you put on the web. So far we've talked a lot about how to build a website, or at least build the structure of a website with all these little bits and pieces that you'd want to display information to the user. So here's what's different about forms. Forms let you collect information from the user, right? So instead of just showing them something interesting, you actually are able to get a response back from the user and send it to your website again. So that's a really great thing because it allows you to make interactive websites instead of just informational websites. You know, they say in the book that probably the most popular form ever is just the Google homepage, and literally this is just a form with two buttons. Okay, search, and I'm feeling lucky. So it's not collecting a lot of information. It's collecting one thing. What do you want to search for? And we're going to type it in. Now you go to other pages like the Facebook sign up page, and I know this is from a few years ago. It probably looks about the same. So this is a kind of form where you've actually got two forms on this page. There's the form at the top where you log in, so you just put in your name and your email and your password. And then there's also the form down there where you put in several bits of information. And you notice a form doesn't have to just be fields like you see for first name and last name. A form can be a drop down that you can choose from some predefined values like month. Okay, well, there's only 12 months that are possible, so I'm not going to make that a free form text because a person could type in blue, and that's not a valid piece of data for that month, right? So you you have different types of form fields, and we'll show you that in just a second here. And I think they have one more example here from Amazon if you're signing up to get something shipped. So forms allow e-commerce basically, right? Without forms, you wouldn't be able to buy anything. So forms are what makes social media possible, what make e-learning, well, e-learning also, right? Because you can have tests; those are forms, and e-commerce available. So they're great, and they're part of that two-way street of interactivity on the web. So we need to learn about them. Now we're going to talk about how a form works in a second. That's right. So here we go. We're going to talk about these controls first. So a really basic form looks like a field looks like this one right here, text input. It's just a single line of text. So type equals text, as you'll see in a second. You've got type equals password, and that is just like a text field, except when you type stuff in, there's just going to be little dots, because if somebody's looking over your shoulder, you don't want that to be actually visible where someone could take a picture of what your password is. And then you've also got, these are actually separate tags, but there's a text area where you can have like a paragraph area where someone can type in, like let's say that you're asking for a review of your website or a review of something on Amazon. They can type in, several lines of text in that text area, and you can change how big that is. There's other sorts of form inputs. For example, there's what they call radio buttons, and that's kind of like buttons on a radio where you can only select one channel at a time. You can't select two channels at the same time, which is different than checkboxes. Whereas, checkboxes, you can actually select multiple ones, like which do you like, check all that apply. And then there is also an option for a drop-down box where you can choose from multiple selections, and it's the same as the radio button, except it's more useful if you really want to save space, and let's say that drop-down is all 50 states. So you don't want to have a radio button for all 50 of your states. It's just going to be a drop-down of states. So it saves space. And lastly, parts of forms, you got to have buttons to make a form work. So you've got submit buttons, and you can actually have a button be an image. I don't endorse an image button just because you then have to go ahead and have alternate text for screen readers. these days we want to really make sure that we make websites accessible for all. So we want to make sure that they can use assistive technologies to read things. So there are other ways of styling stuff besides using images. But oh yeah, and I forgot about these file uploads. That's where you can actually upload a picture or an attachment of some kind to your page. That's a whole other ball of wax. But what I was going to say a second ago is when you're filling this form out, that's only the very beginning of the process. A form actually has to go to a server, and then there's some totally separate program running on that server that's actually going to take that data and process it. It might store it in a database. It might email it to somebody. It might do some math with it. That computer program is going to do whatever it was designed to do. But the important thing is you don't have access to that program as the end user. You don't even really get to know what's going on when you fill this form out. It's kind of just a black box that runs up on a server. And as a web developer, you may work with somebody who's going to write the app, and they'll say, look, I just need you to have a form with these fields and a submit button. It's going to go to me. I'll take care of the rest. So let's talk a little bit more about that, how that step works. So step one, the user is going to fill the form out, and they're going to press the button. So in this case, we've got just a basic text area box, just a basic text box rather, and some radio buttons. So they click submit, and then the name of each form field is sent with the value entered to the server. I guess that's a rack of servers in that picture right there. So let's talk about what that means. Okay, sorry. I think that's the next slide. My apologies. And what they're saying is the server is going to process that information using programming language, and then the server comes back and says, "Thank you. Here's a new web page for you that says thanks for voting." Okay, but yeah, this is what I was going to show you in a second ago. What you're sending up to the server is something called name-value pairs, which is the name of the data that you're sending them up, and is in this case username, and the value is in this case Ivy. And what you do is when you have a form like that, you're sending up the server a big long list of, well, however many fields are in that in that form. However many fields are there, if there's 5 fields, you're going to have 5 name-value pairs with the name of the field and then the value the person chose. If it's a radio button, it's going to be a fixed value, or a drop-down, it's going to be which drop-down one they chose. If it's text, it's going to be whatever they typed in. It doesn't matter. It's the name and the value that was entered for that form. Okay, so name, value, yes, that's what they're doing here on the slides. And that goes to the server. And here's how you tell the form what server to go to. Generally, the form is going to be on the same domain as the site is hosted on. You have to do some complicated stuff if you're going to do cross origin form processing, something called cores, which we won't really get into in this book. Incidentally, I teach a class on server-side programming in the fall, and if you're interested in that and you want to learn more about that, you can sign up for my class. But we do deal with all of that on the server-side level, handling form submissions, handling cross-site submissions, and basically just doing that whole side of things, writing complicated programs to take the data and do cool stuff with it. But fundamentally, what you're doing here is you're going to tell the form where to go. So you can give it, and we learned about relative versus absolute links the other week. So you can give it an absolute URL here that goes to example.com, or you can just say, if you just wanted to, if you were already hosting the site on example.com, you could just send it to join.php, and the site would figure out where it's going. In this case, join.php is a page on the web server, and if you've heard of PHP, it's a programming language that the app could be written in. And sometimes, these days we really don't like to give a clue to what language our app is written in, just so that we can kind of foil some hackers that way. So a more A generic way of doing this would be just like /join and let the server figure it out, right? Now this other thing here called method, there's different methods to submit forms, and that's kind of outside the scope of this book, but basically the two that you're going to run into are get and post, and most of the time forms are going to be doing a post action. The difference is when you're doing a get, that's an HTTP action, and it's usually used to get a website and download it. So if you need to send any form data, you're going to be putting that data in the URL. Whereas if you're doing a post, you're sending the data back up to the server. And so that is all going to be encoded in the body of the form. So it's going to be not in the URL. It won't be in their browser history. It's not any more secure as far as it's still going over the web. If it's over HTTPS, it's more secure, but a post is probably 80% of the time what you're going to see form actions using. Either way, the data is going to get sent to the server. So, and as they say, here's the action, here's the method, and then this is where the stuff goes. So now they're swapping out a basic input tag for this form. So the book actually lists probably 8 or 10 different types of inputs, and they show you examples for each of them. And again, it's not something you're going to need to memorize as much as just be familiar with the different kinds of text inputs and maybe when you would use each one. You can refer to the book or refer to online resources to actually really get the syntax right. That's even what I do. I don't remember every type of HTML tag to do every type of form input. I'm just familiar with them, and so I know, okay, I need to make a form for somebody. Let's think about it. Well, I'm going to need to get some text, and I'm also going to need to have a drop down with a lot of stuff. So I'll draw out the form using an online sketch or even a paper sketch or my iPad or something. And then that kind of, because I know of the different types of inputs to use, that helps me to code it. But then if I need to go look up, now what's the code for a drop down again? A select box? I can look that up online and bring it into my form. So that's okay. It's okay to Google stuff, guys. In this case, they're showing you an input. So this input tag is one of the special self-closing tags. If you notice that the input starts with, bracket input, and then it's got some attributes in it, and then it ends with the / close bracket. And that's okay. And that's because the input doesn't need to wrap around anything. It kind of just is a self-contained item. There's different kinds of inputs. The most common type is just text. It's a text input. And this next attribute here where it says name, that is super crucial. Remember in a couple slides ago we showed you the name value pairs. Without that name, our form doesn't have any name to give this input when it sends it up to the servers. So you've got to have a name on an input for a traditional form post to actually work right. Now the size and the max length, those are all, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep clicking forward here. Size lets you say how many characters wide am I making this thing. These days we style that mostly in CSS, so I don't use size a lot. I do use max length a lot, especially if it's something that I know we have a fixed constraint for this input field. For example, if you're storing this in the database and you know that you can only go 100 characters long, make it 100, so that way the person, if they start typing 101 characters, the browser will stop them and say, hey, sorry, you're done. It won't let you take it in. Now, that's not the only place you should be doing that check. If you're doing server-side programming, you also need to be checking the length on that end before you try to stick in the database. But that's what I call belt and suspenders approach. Probably TMI. Okay, so here's what that code looks like when you render it out. An input field, name, username. Okay. Actually, to be fair with you, that username isn't going to render. I don't know why that doesn't make sense to me. Now this makes sense to me as to what that would render as, because they've actually got the word username colon inside the paragraph, and that's wrapped around the input. To me, that would render this right here. If I just had this input like this, I would just see a box on the browser. I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that's what's going to happen. So they're taking it to the next level. Here we've got a couple of different inputs. One's a type text, the other one's type password. Other than that, there's not really any difference between these two. One's an input type, one's a password type. Now, the only difference is how the browser is going to handle it. The password, it's going to use the little circle dot design to render that on the screen. But other than that, they're the same thing. They're both input tags. They both behave the same way. They need to have different names, and that's to make them unique when you send them up to the server. That program's going to be able to pull out, okay, this is the username, this is the password. If they both were called username, it wouldn't work out well. Again, type password, you're going to end up with these little dots. Okay. Now, this is a text area. Text area, if you recall, is that big chunk of text if you want someone to type in their comments. And on a text area, you're going to have columns and rows. So columns are the width of the box. Like how many characters wide do you want this to be? And rows is going to be the number of rows long that something is going to be. So that's lines of text that you're going to have. All right. Now, yeah, I just said that. Okay, here we go. And this is what it's going to look like. What did you think of this gig? And enter your comments right here. Okay. Now, all right, so all we're doing is we're going over the different types of inputs. Again, I don't require you to memorize all of these, but you remember the radio button that we saw where there's lots of different circles and you could just choose one of them? This is how that works. And it gets a little more complicated because you have to have a different input field for each selection that you want to have. So you notice they've got the input fields, and you notice that the type is now radio. So the browser is going to draw it as a little circle. And here's something weird. Remember how I told you just a minute ago that each of them had to have a unique name? Well, in this case, they all have the same name. In this case, they're all named genre. And that's because this is kind of like they're a collection of all the inputs all together. So each of these is going to be part of this family of radio buttons that we're going to be selecting. And another thing you're going to notice that's a little weird is you've got this text off to the right of each of these items. And that is the label, I guess, for the button. Now, we'll see in a second that we actually have a tag called label. If you get kind of stuck on how to make a radio button, just go look for an example like this and cut and paste it in and change it accordingly. So you'll make sure that all the names are the same because they belong to that family, and make sure they all have a type radio. But what you're going to change for each of these is the value. So for the first one, the value is rock, and then on the right you see in that black text, that's the actual label that you're showing to the right of that little button so the person can read what they're choosing. So when they click on the first one, it's going to say genre equals rock. If they clicked on the second one, it would say genre equals pop, and so on. And if the names did not match up, then they would not be seen by the browser as part of that one group or collection of radio buttons. Radio buttons are a little weird, but they usually just follow this pattern, and life's generally okay. And they're showing you more of those things. I always forget to click forward on the slides, so they're highlighting things that way. But anyway, here you can see the finished product, rock, pop, and jazz. If we didn't have the labels, you would just see 3 little radio buttons with nothing to the right of it, so there wouldn't be any context, and that would be kind of confusing. And the checkbox setup is exactly the same, which is nice, except, of course, your type is checkbox. And from a browser point of view, the way the browser is doing this is it's making it so that they can choose more than one. So let me just skip through all these. And now it's going to render it as, oh yeah, that is a good point. Checked equals checked is going to show if something is checked. Now if I go back to the radio buttons, let's just check on that one. Yeah, it's got checked equals checked as well. So in a radio button, it would not make sense to have more than one checked. You really need to make sure you've only got one checked. And on the checkboxes, you can have more than one checked. Now, if you don't have that attribute on any of them, then you're going to end up with a form with radio buttons that none of them is selected until you start selecting one of them. And the same thing goes for checkboxes. If you don't have checked equals checked turned on any of them, they're just going to have checkboxes with nothing selected. And this is our drop down. We're almost to the end of our different types here. A drop down, even though we call it a drop down, it's actually a select tag. And so this is our select tag. And on this one, we get away with just putting our name at the top. And then we have these different option tags that live inside of it. So you're going to want to have an option for every option in the drop down. Just like we showed with our radio and checkboxes, you'll have a different, well, you'll have the name at the top, but then you'll have the different values for each of the options. And instead of doing checked equals checked, this is a little different because it's a select box. You'll do selected equals selected for the one that you want to be chosen first. A lot of times people will kind of cheat with this a little bit, and they'll put an option that says, please choose one at the top, or something like that as a default value. So if you want to render a form and have something pre-selected, that's what you would do, selected equals selected. And that's a really grainy image, isn't it? Multiple select boxes are so funny in the web because these things render like this, where you can actually choose more than one. However, no one on the internet understands how these things work. So it's okay if you want to fast forward past multiple select boxes. The idea behind them is that someone could have a select box where you could do an option click and you can choose all the ones that you wanted to select at the same time and select multiple things. But it's as confusing as all get out for just about everybody on the internet, so no one hardly uses these anymore. This is what a file input is going to look like, input type file, and it's going to render, if you see that input type file tag right there, type equals file, it's going to render the file chooser, and if someone posts something in the forum, it's going to upload it. Don't worry about that for the purposes of this, but just know that that's a possibility. You can have those. And this is an important point right here. You can have all the inputs that you want in a form, but if you don't do input type submit, then you don't have a way for the person to click a button. So this is another input tag just like your text field, but this one is for submitting something. And it's kind of funny because the type is submit, but you notice how the value is subscribe. And the difference between the two is value means what does the button actually say on it. Okay? The type is always going to be submit if it's a submit button. Value is what are we going to say? Sign up or something like that. What's the form going to say? That's where the subscribe thing is now. And this is an image button, and I do not recommend doing this at all. Please don't do this. So skip over that. That's how to do an image button. Okay. You can have other buttons inside of a form as well, and using a button tag, and we will not cover that in this class. Okay. This is a good point. Sometimes you'll see an input type hidden. This is what you can do if you want to submit some extra stuff along with the form the person's filling out, and you just wanted to, in your HTML, add some extra bit of data for the server's benefit. Doesn't need to be for the person's benefit, so it's kind of hard-coded in the form. So there is a type hidden if you ever see that in a form. Again, we're not going to deal with that in this class, but that's there. Now, all those form controls we went over, and there are a bunch of them, and it took a long time to go over it, and I apologize. All of those really need to be accompanied by something called a label. Um, so let me just sort of get my little laser pointer out here. Um, the label tag right here, this guy, and this is sort of funky the way they've got it. This is the closing tag for him. I would really like to see that, over there as you've seen me talk about indentation before. What the label does is it's for two reasons. One is almost always you're going to actually need to have a label on the side of your field so people will know what to type there. But second of all, label fields are really useful for screen readers. We talked a little while ago about people who need assistive devices to use computers, and if, say, they're visually impaired, something like that, and they can't see what's going on the screen, they're going to hear it, and they're going to hear something read to them. Well, that's what the label really helps them with, is that if they're filling a form out and they're using speech dictation to fill that form out, it'll say age, gender, and it'll read that out to them. So, and you notice a couple of things about the label here. Label, and then it'll say for female, for male, right? This is a really noisy example. I don't know what the deal is with this, but generally you do a for, and if that's for the particular thing that you're doing it for. In this case, what they're doing is, remember back when we did our radios, we just sort of put some text off to the right of it. Instead of that, if you just wrap it in a label tag, it renders exactly the same on the screen. It looks the same, but it helps screen readers a little bit. And so for female, you have to have an ID for this thing. And it's kind of a confusing point on forms sometimes, but most of the time for traditional forms, you're dealing with name-value pairs, right? We talked about that. Well, ID is another way of giving a unique value for something. In this case, for a particular radio button, and the ID lets this guy link to it. So ID really helps us more when we get into CSS. There can only be one item on the page ever with that ID, and that's what that's about. Just a couple of extra things here. Sometimes you can have a field set wrapped around a group of form elements like that, and sometimes you may also want to have a legend, which is kind of the title for that field set. And what that does is it'll draw this sort of like contact details box around. It'll draw this is the field set around this collection of fields, and the legend is the thing at the top. See, contact details, it'll render that right there. Okay. Now, HTML5 has brought a couple of extra things to forms. One is the required field attribute, which I use all the time. That isn't foolproof, but what it really does is the browser will say, hey, you didn't type in the username field. This is required. Sorry, I'm not even going to let you submit this thing until you type something in that box. Now, it can only go so far. You can actually do a little bit more advanced, like regex style validation. We're not going to talk about that here, but you can do some more advanced validation, but at the very basic level, you could just make them type something in. So make them type in a username and a password, and that's what those things will do. So that's pretty nice. And it'll look like something like this. Hey, you didn't fill the field out. Sorry, I'm not even going to let you submit it. HTML5 brings a lot of other extra stuff to forms, like date. So if you did type date, then you'll see it actually have a little date chooser where you'll click. And this is one little problem with that, is every browser implements it differently. So Chrome may have a different little calendar than, say, Safari or Firefox. So if you want to have a little drop down that's consistent, you may want to go through the trouble of installing your own through JavaScript. But it will have a date picker of some kind based on your browser. You've also got type email, and what that'll do is it'll validate and make sure they actually typed in an email. If it's type URL, it's going to make sure they've typed in a valid web URL. And those are going to do this kind of stuff. Please enter an email. Please enter a URL. You can also say the type is search, and this is pretty cool. You can do this actually for every input type. HTML5 adds this thing called placeholder, And what that does is, if you've got a form, it'll pre-fill it with some text. So it'll say, enter a keyword. Now, if there's some text already there, then it won't be there. But if it's a search field, a couple of things it'll do. It'll add this little cancel button, and then if you hit cancel, it'll say, please enter some text. So, all right, let's wrap it up here, guys. This has been a long one. Whenever you want to collect information, form is where you go, right? And it collects information in name value pairs always, so you always want to have a name attribute on all of your input fields. Each one is given a name, and the text the user types in is tied with that name, and that all that stuff is rolled up and sent to the server to whatever action you're going to set that form up to submit to, whatever URL it's going to submit to, either through a GET or a POST, and it's going to have a method with that as well. HTML5 gives you lots of interesting, cool stuff like date validation, email validation, required fields, stuff like that. So, anyway, guys, you're going to end up with forms that are kind of goofy looking because they're not styled pretty. We're getting very near the end of HTML. In fact, we've only got one more chapter left of our little HTML crash course. That's going to be some wrap-up stuff that's going to prepare us for CSS, where we make things look pretty. But until then, this has been Forms.